Steve Clemens. I run the American Strategy Program here at the New America Foundation, and I'm thrilled to be helping to co-host today's gathering with the British Council's Transatlantic Network 2020. We have many guests here from TN 2020. They are the special ones with whom we have amended many other friends, but I want the TN 2020 folks just to raise your hands real quick because we're going to have a conversation, and that means I want the other people in the room to work hard to get to know them. This is part of the networking exercise that we're trying to do in bringing interesting, new, and provocative ideas together with the next generation of young leaders. My partner in today's program, in fact, I have two, is Sharon Memis, Director of the British Council here in the United States. She joined the British Council in London in 1988. She's been an absolute delight to work with in helping to organize this program, and our goal, in fact, is to help partner not only today but in a series of forums with TN 2020 in trying to generate more activities in the United States and particularly in Washington. I'm going to ask Sharon to say a few words, but I also want to introduce another great partner in this exercise who helped marry us, if you will, with the British Council. Hopefully we'll stick together. If not, Ken Edelman is to blame. Ken is the former U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations. I had the pleasure of getting to know Ken Edelman when he was Director of the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency many, many years ago. He didn't scare me away from public service at that point, but got me deeply engaged and involved. Ken is a real public servant, has been very dedicated to try to do what he can to make this an important opportunity for our young leaders. He accompanied President Ronald Reagan on his superpower summits with Secretary General Mikhail Gorbachev of the Soviet Union, the then Soviet Union, and he's a great leader and thinker. So let me ask Sharon Memis to say a few words, and then Ken Edelman will take over the next part of the program. And let me just say one thing. We're going to do this in a couple of parts. We're going to begin a conversation at the beginning, and Ken will take over that. When Foreign Secretary Miliband arrives, we're going to suspend that and then move right into the Foreign Secretary's discussion with all of you. So, Sharon Memis.
Thank you.
Good. You can clap.
Okay. Hello, and thank you very much for coming today. I just wanted to say something very briefly about what we're trying to do with this whole network. Because there are loads and loads of networks, but what we're trying to do here is be a little bit different. We're not trying to get just policymakers or just academics or just journalists together, but we're actually trying to re-energize the transatlantic relationship, if you like, but to bring some almost Renaissance thinking to it. So take a little from history, I guess. What we spotted was very much there was, we have to admit it, rising anti-Americanism in Europe, growing indifference towards Europe in the US, changing demographics, changing dynamics on both sides of the Atlantic. And what we did was, okay, let's have a look at this. We did some research. What we found, though, we tried to take a solution-oriented approach. And what we found is that in spite of the issues, people wanted closer collaboration. Americans overwhelmingly wanted closer collaboration with Europe. And Europeans, in the majority as well, wanted closer collaboration with the US. And there was general agreement on what the common challenges, the global issues were, but discontent that the leaders, if you like, were not very effective at dealing with these issues. And the only area that people thought was effective was trade and business. But everything else, the issues that mattered, on top of the list was climate change, the environment, security and terrorism, similar issues across the Atlantic. So we thought, okay, let's build on this. We may be different, we may have different approaches, but let's find this common ground. So we brought a very, very diverse group of people together, reflecting very much the new society. And we've picked people who we think are going to be the leaders in 2020. Who are already leaders in their own field, but very diverse, ranging from artists through to policymakers, through to police officers working with communities, through to economists, from the left to the right, right across the political spectrum. They don't always agree, which is a good thing, but they are concerned about finding common solutions. And this is what we're trying to do. We have a small group now. We have the major summit launch in September in Ireland. And the main thing about this group is that we don't control it. It is a group that controls itself, which is a bit scary sometimes, but it works. It's an empowering group. We're trying to help, we're trying to facilitate, we're trying to work with partners so that we can get this group and enable it to actually address those issues, to build those relationships very much into the future. So that's the point of the program. We hope many of you will follow it with interest. We want people to know about it. And we're not competitive with anybody. We want to work with other people. And that's a really important point for us. So please contact me if you want more information. Please do take a copy of the brochure. We actually have at least 3 of the writers here who contributed some very thoughtful pieces. Again, we gave them a free brief, and some of them are quite controversial, but very interesting reading. So have a look at that, and there's the research. So I hand over to Ken. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Sharon. When you say this group has no control, I was thinking it's just like the U.S. government in that respect. And when Steve
I also
says...
want you to tell Sharon that there's nothing wrong with a little competition.
There's a lot of competition. And when Steve says you can clap now, it reminds me, I was giving a speech on security in Northeast Asia about 6 months ago, and the head of the Foreign Affairs Committee in Tokyo got up after my speech and said, "Ambassador Edelman, for your remarks, you deserve much clap." And I said, "Well, that's all right. Thank you very much." And of all the things I need, much clap is not one of them. But I appreciate the sentiment.
I just want to mention that this is live streaming to about 10,000 people.
Okay. Well, I appreciate the much clap. That was involved on that. But thank you very much. It is wonderful to be here. And this is a wonderful new network of young people for the Transatlantic Alliance, not just between the Brits and the Americans, but those on the continent as well, and diverse backgrounds, diverse views, and it's really, really a wonderful recipe for trying to make some progress on the alliance. Another good part of the making progress on the alliance is, of course, the new media that's come along, and the father of the blogs is right next to us, right here, Andrew Sullivan, who started it, his own blog when half the room here wasn't involved in blogging, and the other half reading the blogs that we have in this room. But Andrew Sullivan is really a phenomenon. He was the youngest editor ever of the New Republic, and he has been contributing to the dialogue in the United States for 25, 30 years. And just a wonderful, wonderful writer, great mind, a wonderful human being all around. So I thought what we would do is to start the discussion and have Andrew talk to us about transatlantic relations, but more about the relationship of the new media in this, because the whole thrust of TN 2020 is a thrust of not policy elite to policy elite, but more, the whole people-to-people idea of foreign policy, which is actually awfully important and was awfully strong in the Atlantic. And part of that people-to-people has to be the new media, the blogs, the information flow across the pond. And so, Andrew, why don't you start us off on that, and then we'll open it up. We're going to keep this morning, despite having the Foreign Minister of the UK in a great honor, we're going to keep it very, very, very sprightly and quick. And so give us some comments and then spend most of the time reacting to what people say, and we'll keep it snappy, okay? Andrew Sullivan, now Andrew Sullivan really does deserve much clap, all right?
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here with a Foreign Secretary that Senator Clinton would probably regard as way too inexperienced to, obviously unready, cannot possibly be entrusted with the responsibilities of office. Two things. One, I just want to make some remark about the transatlantic relationship. I have a very weird relationship to it. I had 21 years in the UK, followed by 4 years in the US. So I do, in some ways, understand a little bit about both countries, although it feels like things have changed so much that I almost don't recognize the Britain that I left in '84 still being around in 2008. I'm an optimist, I have to say, and I think that some of the rifts between Europe and the US, I think with the benefit of hindsight, do seem to be a function primarily of one president and the challenges and the way he dealt with those challenges after 9/11. I think that with the emergence of David Cameron in Britain and the remarkable similarities that John McCain's domestic policies are beginning to show with respect to the British Tories and the defeat in this primary cycle in the Republican Party of the most retrograde and hardline elements in American republicanism. Defeat may be too strong a word, but at least some kind of relenting. We didn't get a Giuliani, we didn't get a Romney, we didn't get figures who might have divided the alliance even further. We do have a figure in McCain who was at the Tory conference only 2 years ago, who's well known in Britain, who actually is prepared to acknowledge that climate change exists, that's interested in listening to allies rather than constantly lecturing them, but who also is part of the 20th century US-UK relationship and understands it instinctively. One thing I'm also struck by in going and talking to my friends in England is how much enthusiasm there is in the UK for the candidacy of Barack Obama, and even, however hard it is for me to understand, for Senator Clinton. There is a sense that the three candidates who will emerge as the next President of the United States will first of all bring the United States back into the Geneva Conventions, which is something that many Europeans will be grateful for. And amazed that the United States ever decided to trash them. That is the key, I think, transatlantic meaning of these primaries, that the people that believe in, have supported and authorized the torture of prisoners will no longer be running the United States government. That we now know. And that is a huge, huge gain for transatlantic relations. The next thing I want to say is just simply about new media, because it's another way in which I think the world has changed and is changing for the better in transatlantic relations. I've been writing a column for the Sunday Times in London for 15, 16 years. So it's been a funny and fascinating way to examine how new media has affected the way one writes. I remember the old days when you literally wrote a piece, faxed it, even in some cases dictated it over the phone. I mean, this is I'm not that old, but in my lifetime that's what I was doing. And it would disappear into a void and be published, Sunday Times, a big paper in England, many, many times. And there was a total unreality between what one was doing here and what was happening over there. And there was also a sense that what you wrote over there would, as anywhere, disappear within a few days. It would. I remember a lovely moment when I was worried about a column I'd written, and having been trained in sort of American journalism, was very upset about maybe getting a fact wrong, which is not something that tends to frustrate or worry British journalists. So I called up the sub-editor, as they call them, on the Sunday Times. I was rather worried. I'm sorry, I think I may have got, I can't remember what was the thing wrong in this column. And he said, oh, I wouldn't worry about that, mate. He said, that's fish and chips now, mate. Clearly, only the English people will even understand what that means. My column was gently wrapping a battered cod at that point, and that was its fundamental purpose. And in England, one always understood that whatever one wrote, at some point, it would have a more interesting and practical use than anybody reading it. These days, of course, that's almost impossible. That Google has rendered the possibility of any of one's brilliant insights ever being lost, thank God, forever. And when one writes in England and for the English, one's also writing instantly online in a way that appears instantly in London as well. And one noticed in this election campaign particularly, which is perhaps the one where new media has shown its power most effectively, that the act of journalism in America and the act of journalism in England are becoming harder and harder to tell apart. You see a magazine like The Economist essentially being a British magazine that is essentially now an American magazine. That's where it sells the vast majority of its copies. You see a newspaper like The Guardian, and to some extent my own paper, and others in Britain being part of the debate in the American political campaign. Not a dominating part of the debate, but definitely a part of the debate. You go to the blogs, and then you find also that in the debate over the war, the blogs in London and around the world and in Europe were fueling an interaction and a dialogue that was facilitated by this new media that would never have happened in quite the same way before. And when Americans now go to England and hear the sophistication that people have about the election in this country, I mean, the sheer amount of knowledge, data, and nuance that they have absorbed, it is partly because this medium has enabled instant response. It's made my job harder because I used to assume that they didn't know very much. And so I could get away with all sorts of things. I could hack out a column. I could ponder deeply about a column and craft it carefully and send it into the political bloodstream, knowing that they wouldn't know any better. And sometimes, in fact, the task of writing a column over there was to make sure you didn't put too much sophisticated information in it because it would confuse or bewilder people. They weren't interested in these esoteric points about American politics. They weren't interested in, what was a neoliberal, what was a neoconservative. They were interested in more basic things. Now, the language, the lingua franca of the web has enabled these nuances to be extraordinarily well observed on both sides of the Atlantic. And I find now writing a blog on an hourly minute, actually I'm due for another post. One is going to go up, I think, in about 5 minutes due to the miracle of future publishing. But to write it actually instantaneously in both countries and to write about British politics and American politics is really a totally new world to be in. It is as if we still do have separate readerships and separate audiences because the debate and natural interest in what one's localities are. But increasingly, I think of Britain in a way, or London and southern England particularly, as basically another blue state. That it is essentially an English-speaking, at this point, center-left, maybe center-right blue state, a very big blue state, and a blue state with lots of red and white in it. But it is nonetheless a very similar cultural entity and no greater difference in a way between what one writes there than one would have to translate for Alabama or California. In fact, I sometimes feel that in writing my blog it's going to be better understood in London than it will be in certain parts of the United States. That this fusion of the culture and the politics of the two countries is really gaining. Now, it's always been the case. You can absolutely see, and certainly in the last 30 years, an interesting dynamic. You see Thatcherism that clearly presaged Reaganism. You saw, obviously, the Clinton-Blair dynamic. You have not seen in Britain anything like what we now call neoconservatism, because they're not running an empire, so they do not have to construct an ideology to sustain it. But you do have now an interesting shift in British conservatism, which has latched itself onto environmental politics as a critical core meaning of conservatism. You do have the sense that Cameron and McCain are interested in reforming public services, not abolishing them, in order to make them more effective and more accountable. You see a greater fiscal responsibility, one hopes, at least rhetorically, with McCain. And you also see a more constructive, I think, and less confrontational notion of foreign policy. I don't quite know when and how this catalyzing effect of new media will change dramatically British-American politics. I do think they're becoming quite similar. I do think they're becoming more and more cross-fertilized. And I do think that's a great thing. And especially since it means that one's own readership is increased.
Andrew, let me stay up there a minute, and let me just ask you a question. You say you have to file for another entry in the blog in the last 10 minutes, which prompts the question to me, looking at this new media, is it the immediacy that drives out thought on this? I mean, is the pace such that you can't do thoughtful pieces like you used to do in New Republic and Atlantic Monthly?
Yes.
I mean, how much are you sacrificing on the immediacy in terms of serious thought?
I think there is inevitably some sacrifice. I mean, I would, in some ways, blogging's immediacy and constancy I mean, lots of people here are bloggers, actually, does put one in danger of being a synapse reacting to other synapses and not having the experience of actually thinking deeply through a subject. However, I might also add that it has, and the way that my own blog has developed into a sort of daily, hourly magazine, it has exposed me in ways to materials and ideas and articles and essays that would otherwise be lost to me.
Wonderful punctuation. I'm sure is coming.
You are now lost to all of us.
Yes, I am.
I will hold that thought.
No.
I will cede the chair.
Great. We're going to move right here.
Okay.
And Sam, if you could move this table back. Andrew, I sincerely apologize. There are not many times. Yeah, I can go down in history the only person who could stop Andrew Sullivan mid-sentence. We're very pleased, with again, as I mentioned, working with the British Council and the TN 2020 network and all of the other special guests we've arrived to welcome on behalf of the New America Foundation, on behalf of our chairman, whom I understand David Miliband sat next to the other day, the chairman of our group, Rita Hauser, the chairman of the board of the New America Foundation, Eric Schmidt. It's a great pleasure for me to welcome Foreign Secretary David Miliband to join us today. David is primarily a blogger. And he is, as Andrew Sullivan and how many bloggers are in the room? Raise your hand. Quite a number. Play with this. We've put a special focus on bloggers and writers. Essentially, we are the next generation managers of high-octane policy content. And whether you are working for a journal, a think tank, or happen to be the foreign minister of a country, blogging is sort of a new vehicle. And I've become a great fan of David Miliband's blog and was very pleased one day when he linked to me. He was appointed by Gordon Brown to be Secretary of State for Foreign and Commonwealth Affairs. His blog, Global Conversation, is the first blog authored by a British cabinet member. He previously served as Secretary of Communities and Local Government, Secretary for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. He's been a member of Parliament since 2001. He's got a cool website for his constituency, which I was on this morning. On Thursday, he'll join Secretary Rice for a visit to her hometown in California as well. Today, he's also speaking, and I should mention those folks who are watching live streaming. There'll be a major speech today, just after this, at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, which will be live on C-SPAN as well. So without further ado, and so we can get to our conversation, please help me welcome Foreign Secretary David Miliband.
Can I sit here?
Yeah, sure. We should give you a mic. I'm going to give you a mic. Okay.
Thank you very much, Steve. I don't know what are you expecting? What do you want?
Brilliance.
Great ideas. Kind of boil down the speech you're going to give to the real bottom line zingers.
Right. Okay. Well, let me make 3 points really. I mean, the first is that there's obviously irony in what you say about the importance of bloggers to foreign policy, but I think there's also reality, because my basic view is that if you want to get something done in foreign policy today, you need three groups aligned, really. You obviously do need government. The virtues of old diplomacy, being the people who write the minutes, knowing what the other people think before they think it, before they come and negotiate with you, those are all important virtues and important to any deal. But government to government is not enough to get foreign policy progress. You need, secondly, to align market and business drive. I think if I think about an issue like Turkey's entry into the EU, that is a major issue of negotiation between the government of Turkey and the countries of the EU. But the truth is, one of the biggest drivers for Turkey's entry into the EU and the acceptance of Turkey's entry into the EU will be the partnerships between Turkish business and European business that helps change the minds of Europeans about what Turkey really stands for and what the new Turkey is. So secondly, you need to align business, and third is mass mobilization, because in the end there is a more open and public and ongoing democracy that all politicians have to respond to. So I freely admit my blog is much more boring than yours. The confines of government mean that it's
You have a censor?
No, I don't. I have a self-censor. There are limits to what you can do, but it's intended not to be the last word in blogging, but to be the first word in foreign policy blogging or foreign minister blogging, because I'm sure there are better ways of doing it. But I think it's intended to give people a way of engaging, and it's meant to be a dialogue, not just a one-way. Secondly, I think it's really important to say that there are great causes left in foreign policy. People talk about a post-Cold War world, a post-9/11 world, in our case a post-7/7 world, 7th of July 2005, when there were bombs on the streets of London. And it's easy to name the great insecurities that we face. International terrorism, conflicts that are unresolved, climate change and global inequality, weak international institutions. Actually, I think you can turn those round. It is a great cause to build genuine links across race and religion and region that join people together by their common humanity rather than divide them in a quote-unquote clash of civilizations. That, for me, is the battle against international terrorism, as well as our troops in Helmand province in southeastern Afghanistan. It is a great cause, I think, to take on the conflicts that blight people's lives, help to prevent conflicts, but also address them. We're dealing with this at the moment in Europe with the last piece of the Yugoslav jigsaw in Kosovo. But obviously the conflicts in the Middle East are at the heart of the international debate. It's a great cause to try to promote peace in that region. Thirdly, I think that the drive for human development and to tackle climate change is a great cause that brings people together. And fourthly, and this is difficult in a British context, because we have a very difficult and partisan debate about the European Union, where it's a central feature of the opposition's argument that it's the overweening power of international institutions that threatens national sovereignty and threatens our ability to make change in our lives. I actually think it's the weakness, stroke ineffectiveness of international institutions that should concern us, and we should be seeking to build them up, not knock them down. That's why I'm a strong, I believe in reforming the European Union, but I'm a strong pro-European. So I think there are big causes left, and the message that I'm giving in America, I was in New York yesterday, I'm here in DC, and then on to California. The world does need American leadership on these issues. There's a great debate that involves quite a bit of self-doubt, I think, about the role of America in the world. And the point I would make is that none of the big problems are going to get solved without the engagement of the United States. The United States government, the United States business, but also the United States citizens. And this is the least cynical country in the world, as far as I'm concerned, least cynical actually in all those three spheres. And I think that it's important that not just American government, but America, with all of its entrepreneurialism and its sense of can-do, is engaged in these big challenges. The third thing I was just going to say is a word about how does the UK fit into this, because there was a jibe from in the immediate post-Second World War period that Britain had lost an empire and never found a role, and we're not going to try and get our empire back. We're never going to be the biggest. We're never going to try to define ourselves by how much of the world's surface we control. But I think that the United Kingdom does plug into a unique set of networks through the transatlantic relationship, through the European Union, through its membership of the Security Council, through an organisation like the Commonwealth. I don't know how many of you come from Commonwealth countries, but a quarter of the world's population is in the Commonwealth. That is an underused asset in my view. So I think the UK is plugged into a series of networks. Secondly, it's got a set of assets that I think are very, very valuable. It has diplomatic assets in 260 posts around the world, but it also has cultural assets like the BBC and the British Council, which are important. I mean, British Council obviously sponsoring today and sponsoring the TN 2020 network. It has cultural assets, and it also has military assets. And the work that our military are doing in Afghanistan, which I'm going to be speaking about today, in Iraq, I think that those are an important part of our contribution to peace and security around the world. Thirdly, we have the unique asset of the English language, which remains an important part of our of who we are as a country. And we've also got, and I think that this is something that's important, we have a genuine sense that not only are we winners from globalization, but actually the problems of globalization are not served by rolling back globalization, but are served by extending it. So if you care about inequality or unsustainability or insecurity that arises from the process of globalization, we're people who believe that we are going to tackle those problems through more trade, not less. We're going to tackle those problems through more engagement, not less. We're going to tackle those problems through more internationalism and more international engagement, not less. And I think that's an important part of the British character. And that's what leads me to describe Britain not as a global empire, but as a global hub. And a global hub is a place that is plugged into the ideas, the people, the money that matters. And that's what we want to do. I got the idea from the City of London in the global financial market, where certainly for the European time zone, London is the global hub. And I hope that in diplomacy we can play an important role as well. Just a final point, the launch of the TN 2020 network, which we are doing, I think is important. I mean, the energy that exists in organizations like this, in networks like this, I think is something that we probably haven't tapped properly in foreign policy terms. But as I tried to say at the beginning, I think it's an important part of the debate, and people may want to ask me questions about a whole range of foreign policy issues, but I hope you'll also reflect on the fact that the network that you're launching, which I think is going to be expanding over time, is something that has an important contribution to make. Not least, I mean, in a way, the easy thing is to link the UK and the US. The tough thing, but the important thing, is to link to the bloggers in Iran, or to link to the journalists network in Peshawar that I met when I was there 3 or 4 weeks ago. And I hope that you'll think, therefore, in the same way that you'll think not just about a bridge across the Atlantic, but that you'll think about a global conversation, which is what, in the end, we need. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. We have a few minutes. We're going to open up questions, very brief questions and very brief responses if we can. And we need to call on our TN 2020 team first. But let me ask David just one quick question. When Richard Haass, the President of the Council on Foreign Relations here in the United States, at this very podium, said that when Americans talk democracy, regrettably, as he said, they often think just about voting and what he considers ballotocracy. When you go around the world and ask them when they are willing to sort of think through what democracy means, they usually report back it means something that has to do with justice. When you talk about democracy, and from the British sense, what are you talking about in trying to, shine up this democratic, liberal message from the West? How are you framing it?
Well, I think it gives me a good chance to reprise my lecture that I'm giving. Thank you very much. Later on. I mean, when I talk about a democratic imperative, what I'm talking about is not just elections every 4 or 5 years. And in a way, I think that there has been the equation of democracy with quinquennial elections, in a way, is not just simplistic and glib. It's actually, in a way, the end of the process, not the beginning. And so one of the things that I'm trying to do in my speech today, which is called Dilemmas of Democracy, and tries to look at the situation in Afghanistan and Pakistan, 2 very difficult test cases, both for the development of democracy internally and for the quote-unquote promotion of democracy. I don't really like the word, but for the support of democracy from outside, 2 very difficult test cases. I think there are important lessons that independent judiciary, free media, are an important part of a democratic system. It's an obvious thing to say, but it is too often neglected. That you have to think local and not just national. I mean, it's ironic that to have to remind a British or an American audience of this, but our democracy didn't start with national elections. It started locally and was built up to a national level, rather than starting nationally and built down to a local level. That you have to have an inclusive political system, and this is a difficult thing. If you go to the borders of Afghanistan and Pakistan, on the Pakistani side, you've got the federally administered areas that have never had political parties in the 60 years of since the independence, the creation of the state of Pakistan. That's an exclusive political system, not an inclusive one, and I think that's a problem. So I think it's worth reflecting on that's why I think it's probably better to talk about democratic accountability, which I think suggests the richness of some of the ideas, rather than quote-unquote democracy, which can come across as a bit glib.
And we'd be happy to email the CSIS longer answer to that later to anyone. For the TN 2020 crowd. Questions? Yes, sir. And if you'll identify yourself, too.
Alessandro Fusacchia from Italy, TN 2020. Most Americans, according to a recent poll, believe that the UK is the most influential country within the European Union in Europe. But at the same time, there is a rising. I'm trying to be provocative a little bit because there is a rising.
So far, so good. I like it so far.
As long as it's really fast
There is a rising skepticism among continental Europeans on the role of the UK within the European Union. So what's your view on that? Can it really be a bridge between the two?
I don't like the bridge. You mean the bridge between Europe and America? I don't like the bridge metaphor myself. Not just because people walk over bridges, but
they fall down.
And bridges fall down. But bridge suggests, what's the bridge idea? The bridge idea is that we should take messages from Paris and Berlin and Rome and convey them to Washington, and we should take messages from Washington and sort of translate them into. That's not good, because you actually want those countries. You want your country, Italy, to have a strong relationship with the United States. You want France to have a. You're looking very worried about that. I think it's good if France has a strong and positive relationship with the US. I think it's good if Berlin and Washington are working close together. That's not bad. It's not a zero-sum game. It's not actually bad for the UK's relationship with the US if the US has a good relationship with Germany. Actually, I think it's a good thing, not a bad thing. And I don't think we should see it in those sort of competitive terms. That's why I think it's got to be. We've got our own relationship with the US. It's our single most important bilateral relationship, but we're members of the European Union, and we're members of the European Union. And I think those things are not just compatible; they're actually complementary.
Good answer, Christoph von Marshall.
Christoph von Marshall, I'm U.S. correspondent for a German newspaper here.
I'd be pleased with what I just said.
We have a common friend. Thatcher, Mrs. Thatcher, which is a friend of your family. Okay, I want to follow up on the EU. I just want to follow up with the EU thing and the integration. I mean, you have a common language with the US. We don't have a common language inside Europe. And you talked about how important it is to connect, that these are really the tools for future policy. How much is this an obstacle? How can we overcome it? Because I think that rather 5% and not more of a population are really reading foreign media, blogs, newspapers, and so on.
Particularly the Washington Note.
I think there's a common language even for people who don't speak the same language, if you know what I mean. In Europe, there is a common set of norms and a common set of assumptions and some common elements to the way we see the world. And there's a common set of values, I suppose you'd say. And I mean, it's slightly embarrassing for someone who's British, because so many more people speak English, and it's sort of become an advantage for us. But it's become the sort of lingua franca of the European Union. And so I don't want to seem I don't want to seem complacent about it. But I think that the European Union has changed. I think that's a really important message to get across to an American audience, that the European Union now of 27 is a different beast than the European Union of 12 or 15. It's a much more balanced animal, with Central and Eastern Europe now part of it. It has a different perspective on its eastern neighbours. It's got a different view of itself. It's got a different dynamic, and I think that's quite important. But I nonetheless think it's held together by some very strong common values, and I think that's important.
Great. From the TN.
Mary Fitzgerald from Ireland. Mr. Miliband, if the Lisbon Treaty is ratified, what impact do you think this will have on the transatlantic relationship? Because in Ireland, some yes campaigners have been saying that Lisbon, if it is ratified, that Europe will be a counter to US power in the world. And also there are some reservations within the US about the threat, perhaps, that the Lisbon Treaty could pose to the NATO alliance. And also I'd like you to comment on reports in the European media this week that you're tipped as a likely successor for Javier Solana's job.
Well, that's certainly
and was that leaked by Gordon Brown?
Certainly not true. certainly not. It's news to me, and it's nonsense, really. I think it was in a German paper, actually. Yeah. No. Thank you. I think what the Lisbon Treaty does is it buries, finally, a sterile institutional debate that the European Union has been having for far too long, and that has got in the way of actually being the best sort of partner for the US and elsewhere. I think that the passage of the Lisbon Treaty allows us to be a better partner, not a new rival for the United States. I think that the foreign policy machinery is not changed in a fundamental way, but there are some useful changes. And I think that it equips Europe to get on with the real business, which is the European Union for 40 or 50 years has been driven by social standards, environmental management, the development of a currency within its borders. But it's been relatively weak about thinking beyond its borders. It's had a trade negotiating role, but beyond that it hasn't really been an externally facing organisation. In a world of interdependence, migration, climate change, those are the big energy, those are the big issues that the European Union is going to prove itself or not over the next 15 or 20 years. And I think that's that's a thing that needs us to get on with it, not, and I think the Lisbon Treaty will allow us to do that.
No comments on the next appointment.
No, I'm not.
So
I
from
no, it's nonsense.
I was just joking. Here's a great blogging diva, Laura Rosen.
Thanks. Israel confirmed today that its peace talks are underway with Syria and Turkey. I've just come back from Israel, where I've interviewed several former security and foreign ministry types who advocate a greater degree of engagement, either with Hamas or with Syria. Can you talk a little bit about engagement? It's become a controversial issue here with the White House sort of officially saying that it's appeasing evil, but all sorts of signs that Washington may have withdrawn vetoes on different tracks of peace negotiations.
I mean, I think it's important that Syria is a country, Hamas is a terrorist group. They've obviously got links, but it's important to separate them out. We stand very strongly behind the quartet position in respect of Hamas, which is that the minimum basis for engagement in negotiation is that they should recognize the state of Israel, that they should renounce violence, and that they should accept previous Palestinian commitments. I think it's also important to emphasize there is an elected leader of the Palestinian people, and that is Mahmoud Abbas, President Abbas. And rightly, he is leading the negotiations on the behalf of the Palestinian people for a state which they desperately need. In respect of Syria, I was in Turkey last week, not in Israel, talking to the Turks about this. The way I would answer this is to say that if you think back to the Annapolis meeting, there was a debate in advance of that about whether or not Syria would participate and what basis it should participate. And we were of the view strongly that they should be there. And the agenda was such that they were able to raise their issues about Golan Heights. And my point about this would be that it's important that a Syria track is not seen as an alternative to a Palestinian track. And I think that the way the Annapolis agenda was structured and now the focus that there's been put on the two-state solution is right. But in that context, the discussions between Israel and Syria will go on. And I think, I think the context is important, and the history since Annapolis is important as well.
We'll here to another TN 2020 person. Sorry.
Hi, David Stephen. It seems to me that one of the major challenges for globalization is rising expectations coupled with limits to strategic resources, food, emissions, energy. How do you think that's going to affect the future of international relations?
I think it's a really, really, really interesting question. I mean, this triple crunch of credit, fuel, and food, I think is unique. I don't think I've seen, I can't think of a previous historical period when you've had a similar crunch. I mean, certainly in 1973 you had high oil prices, but you didn't have the similar credit and food situation. I think there is a common denominator between the food and the fuel crunch, and that is about carbon dependence. And high carbon dependence is obviously driving up the oil price. That in turn driving up transport costs, driving up food costs. And climate change then closes the circle. So I think that how will the world respond? It depends on whether we can get onto a lower carbon trajectory or not. If we get onto a lower carbon trajectory, then I think it's manageable. If we can't get onto it, are all these people walking out, or are they? No.
This is a complex machine at work.
This is a staged walkout.
This is all to pay respect to you.
Oh, I see. It's a funny way of showing it. So I think if we can't get onto a lower carbon trajectory, then the sort of conflicts that people fear over resources are a real danger, I would say. And you're seeing, the whole debate about Darfur, in part, has a resource climate aspect to it. It may not be the primary issue, but it's a contributing and factor that is dangerous.
I'm giving the last question to Ambassador Kenneth Edelman, who is going to take the question. He is sitting next to, of course, Andrew Sullivan.
I know, I interrupted Andrew's speech, which is a terrible thing to do.
Narit Eisenman with the Washington Post is going to be offering her own sizzling response to
I think
to
that
your
we were
remarks.
at university together.
I
think we were. I think you may have been.
And they admit it. But let me give Ken Edelman the last response, and then what we're going to do is just briefly move the foreign minister out to meet some of the TN 2020 people, and then I will be back and we will continue our program. Ambassador Edelman.
Thank you so much, and thank you for showing your support for the TN 2020 on this. Let me ask you a general question. One of the things that it seems to me that the Americans and the Brits and the Continentals share right now is the trouble with their leaders, if I may say. It's no surprise to say that Gordon Brown has hit a patch that is uncomfortable. It's no surprise to hear that George W. Bush is not widely admired in America anymore. And it's no surprise to hear that the Italians, the French, you go around Europe, you think to yourself, boy, it is just a bad time for leaders. Is it the fact that the leaders are disappointing us? Is it the fact that the new media is such that it's not very conducive to the kind of leadership? Why is it, you say, and it's a brilliant insight, that the whole combination of the food, fuel, and credit is a unique combination. This is a rather unique combination that people just don't like their leaders. Can you comment on that?
Well, I think it is the food, the fuel, and the credit. You see, I just said this in a previous meeting, actually. Someone said to me last night that in the United States, median income in 2007 was still below the 1999 level. That you've had a period where median household income has really suffered. And that's been part of your political dialogue over the last 7 years. Is that not right?
I don't know.
I was told that, I mean, there's been real, people are nodding, I mean, it's been a real tough time in terms of median income. Now, in the UK, median income, personal disposable income has basically risen every year for the last 10 years. And that has been, some of the biggest gains haven't been right at the bottom, but broadly speaking, it's been more rather than less egalitarian, in that the people at the lower end have got more or less. I mean, actually, people right at the bottom 5%, possibly even 5 to 10%, have really had a tough time. But the next 2 deciles or even 3 deciles have done quite well. But median income has gone up. Now, that's stopped this year. People are noticing every time they go to the shop, they're noticing every time they go to the gas station, and the credit crunch is a source of real fear and insecurity. And I think that that is an important part of the equation that makes it difficult to be in government anywhere. And I think the question is whether governments are responding by doing the right thing or the wrong thing. Now, the right thing does not bring immediate relief, but the right thing does mean that you've got the best chance of weathering the storm. And that, in the end, is going to be the test, I think, for our government and for other governments. And, you know, other governments that have had, the Italian government had an election this year that was bad timing.
Mr. Foreign Minister, thank you very much for blurring the lines between blogging and foreign ministry leadership and foreign ministry work. On behalf of the British Council and New America Foundation, I want to thank you very much for hanging out with us today. We're going to put a pause here. I'm going to walk Foreign Minister Miliband out and turn this over to my good friend Ken Edelman.
Great. Thank you.
Sorry. And Gary.
Mr. Foreign Minister, could I just ask you quickly, representing the old media in the room, what would be the most helpful role for the next U.S. president to play with respect to engagement with Iran?
How long have you got for that for that answer? I think that discretion is the better part of valor in giving advice to campaign teams. And since I'm meeting all of the campaign teams, I'll give my advice directly to them and reserve it for the moment.
That's the Associated Press. It's a good opportunity.
Can I expand on that just very briefly? You mentioned, Elise Labott from CNN, you mentioned about reaching the bloggers in Iran. And how do you use the new media in Iran, in a state such as Iran, where there really isn't, you know, the kind of democracy that exists from that?
I mean, it's a really good point. I mean, partly you use old media. The Farsi TV that the BBC is going to be launching this year is an important part of that. Secondly, in respect of the new media, my experience, or the information I've been given, is that Iranian bloggers are extremely numerous, but also extremely smart at plugging themselves into global new media networks. And I think that that's very significant. I was told that there are more bloggers per head in Iran than in any other country in the world. That's true. It's true. I was told it, and it was true. I think that suggests that you've got a really willing audience. Remember, it's a highly educated, highly civilized, highly, It's a country of enormous history. And I think there's an audience waiting there for engagement.
And we have other audiences waiting
Right.
for you.
Okay.
So thank you all very much. Thank you.
That's great.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. That's a wonderful, wonderful treat. If everybody could stay in their seats for a minute, we're going to have comments on the foreign minister and his remarks and anything else, and we're going to have our TN 2020 group come back to us. And what I thought we would do is to start off with Nurit, if you would. Just take the podium right there. Nurit Eisenman was with the editorial board of the Washington Post, is now in the Metro section, and is just a wonderful addition to us this morning. So thank you.
Hi. Well, we've been asked to sort of riff a little bit off of the remarks. Some personal history to provide the background to some of my reaction. In 2005, I spent the year covering Afghanistan and to some extent Pakistan for the Washington Post. And I thought that was a controversial and, posting. And then I came back and began to cover immigration. And now I really know what controversy means. And one of the things that was interesting to me when I was in Afghanistan, and even more so in Pakistan, was the disconnect between a lot of the views of what would be regarded as liberal Pakistanis and what Americans here might think of them. Even among people who are very much fighting for human rights in Pakistan, just incredibly strong feelings against the Bush administration and very suspicious of the intervention in Afghanistan. So there was clearly a need for more communication between these two, peoples. And when I came back here to the United States to cover immigration, I was really struck by the tenor of the conversation. And this is no surprise to any of you, but when you get the emails, every morning my inbox is filled with responses to what we've written on any given day. And the vitriol and the anger is tremendous. And we've been trying now to expand our work on immigration into the blogosphere, maybe create some sort of a blog-type site for the paper. And one of the real challenges that we're facing is how do we construct it in such a way that it actually fosters constructive dialogue and exchanges as opposed to either both sides slinging mud at each other, or what often happens when I've been looking at a lot of sites that focus on immigration, it tends to be, people of one perspective all looking at the same site and reinforcing each other's views, and people of the other perspective all reinforcing each other's views. And I don't get that much exchange. I don't really see a lot of exchange between the two sides. And it's clearly immigration in this country is a hugely looming issue. It's only going to become more so, if you look at the demographic projections. And internationally, it's in a lot of other countries, it's also similarly, if not more, important as a long-term issue. And I was struck, in the remarks about, the idea of trying to foster more conversation globally through the blogosphere and through this medium. If we can't manage to do it even internally in our own country, where we share a lot of the same values, we have a lot of the same cultural references, we have no linguistic barriers, how do you do it internationally? So one thing that I'd be curious, to hear from the audience is, whether you have come across mechanisms that you think overcome this issue. Have you come across sites that genuinely overcome this issue? Because I think that is one of the big challenges as we try to use this medium for something, even more constructive than it has been so far.
Nurit, thank you very much. That's a very interesting perspective. And Andrew, I want to get your ideas on this. Whether more dialogue, basically, and more communications means that you understand your differences more and you have more to fight about. Obviously, you look at we had a good question on the Middle East. There's no lack of dialogue between the Israelis and the Arabs, all these years, and it seems the more they talk, the more hatred there is on both sides, at least in some quarters on that. So this idea, and I guess it's an adolescent idea, that if only we talked more, we would understand each other. Sometimes we understand each other and we don't like each other more. So how do you, I think that's a very good point. And the blog, the whole idea of jumping in, as the idea of email is, that you jump in they say that the emotions are running rampant when you do that because it's so instant, and you can't, have time to put a postage stamp on it and think about mailing it the next day. I know that Lincoln, during the Civil War, whenever he got mad, he wrote somebody a letter. I don't know how mad he was, but he always kept it there on his desk, and, it was time before he could mail it. He didn't send an email to anybody.
Yes, well, one tends to put one's emails in that pile for a day. I think that the web, because of its instant character, because of its anonymity, particularly, does foster flaming, does foster exactly this kind of. It's much easier to vent to Nerith Eisenman anonymously by an email than it is to go up to you and talk to you face to face. So I don't think there's any solution to it except editing, which means that whoever runs the site or whoever has the site actually finds a way to include differing views in a way that does not simply let them run rampant. Now, the compromise I came to in the end, and I've never allowed comments on my own site, and I actually asked the readers recently, did a poll on whether they should have comments, and a majority of them said, no, we don't want to hear from ourselves, which is kind of an interesting, precisely because this phenomenon. So what I try and do is actually, and it's more work, but I think this is why old media can inform new media, is actually to read emails that come in and select the best and fairly put them. I have a dissent of the day feature, and I have people, I try and find the most interesting or cogent argument and air it within the same space. And if you get a reputation for not just doing Potemkin ones, but actually having ones that actually really make you feel bad and make you realize you screwed up, and that's helpful. I do think editing matters, and that the new media still requires old media editing, and that's the only way to do it.
This works. There we go. Yeah, well, one of the things that was disappointing to me is, I don't mind if someone criticizes me, but it's more that they start to interact with each other. If you look at the reader comments at the end of any article that's posted in the paper online, and the back and forth quickly degenerates into either insulting arguments or just boring arguments, which is possibly even worse, right? This is an issue among many, and often I think foreign policy lends itself to similar thing, where there are very varying perspectives, and the stakes are actually quite high, and in theory it would actually be quite beneficial to create some format for genuine exchange between people, and I don't feel that we've achieved it just yet, and as you say, I mean, one way is to simply just try to we've been they've been educating us about all kinds of software out there that finds ways of weeding out people who are particularly unhelpful and sort of blocks them from the debate. But it's a kind of a negative response, and it's not one that I relish. One thing I'm curious about with your site is, do you have a sense of what the share of people who read your site are people who truly disagree with you, as opposed to here and there disagree with you on the margins?
I've managed to cultivate a readership that is forced to disagree with me in large part over a period of years, because I regularly cull my readership from people who previously thought they agree with me and no longer do. So maybe I'm not the right person. I wanted to actually just throw about David Miliband and people's impressions of him, because what struck me, apart from his astonishing youth and vitality, which, I mean, he's the Foreign Secretary. I know he went to school. I know, it's terrifying. I went to school with Bart. I mean, it's a small country.
They said that Henry Kissinger, whenever he went to a reunion, ruined every reunion he ever went to. Made everybody feel terrible.
Well, it's just frightening to think of one's own generation running anything. I think there's that moment when I think some of us are getting to that point now, where you just think, Jesus, is this all there is? But what struck me about him is and the way he represents a certain kind of English and British perspective at this point. You see a British Foreign Secretary really with no desire no interest in throwing his weight around the world. That there is within the and this is the Europeanization of Britain in a way, that he does understand, rather like bloggers begin to understand, that this is not a zero-sum world. That in fact being a global hub, allowing oneself to be a place where the entire world communicates and is more important for one's own national success than it is than in the old terms, in a way in which various questions about the European Union we're talking about. Why is it bad for Britain that Germany has a strong relationship with the U.S.? Is it? And there's always these old neuroses in Europe. Whenever, for example, Bush would meet with the Germans, there would be, oh Jesus, the special relationship is dying. Now there's less of that sense at all. There's more a sense that these are what Philip Bobbitt would call market states, in which their job is to maximize the opportunities for the people within them, as opposed to exert and project global power. Now, the United States obviously is not in that position. I mean, it's still the hegemon, and it still has a more traditional great power role in the world. But it is clear to me to watch a country like the UK evolve over a period of 50 years. And one can see politics in this country and understanding of foreign policy evolving in the United States in similar fashion. I'm also struck, I'm just giving you impressions, at the sense among adult Europeans, and the knowledge, it's not in the sense, knowledge that the United States is indispensable, that its leadership and its guidance is indispensable. And I think part of the crisis of the last few years has been a sense that even though they believed that to be the case, they did not feel able to be part of that process anymore. They felt shut out of that process in a way that I think, in retrospect, even though I can understand fully why in 2002, for example, the United States felt it couldn't listen and wait, why, in fact, in retrospect, we can nevertheless see that had its costs and consequences, and there is an attempt to repair that. And I think that's a good thing, and it's an evolution. I mean, and the evolution of the United Kingdom from the great power status to the global hub status. Well, actually, from global hub to great power back to global hub. If you think of Britain in the 17th or 18th centuries as essentially a commercial enterprise, rather like the Netherlands, that's what it's returning to.
I was struck by that as well, but I also wondered, there seems to be a disconnect in the UK, and the UK is just one example, between the views of the leadership, the political leadership on that front, and the populace, and you definitely detect, especially with the unpopularity of this administration and the Iraq War, a deep reluctance, among their own constituents of, are we being dragged along by this power that doesn't, run things right, or in terms of competence, or in terms of the actual agenda, and we're being dragged along, and there's a kind of residual, basically, I mean, you see it with the Canadians, for example. Just a deep resentment of the idea that they're being asked to play along, and I, one thing that I would have wanted to ask him, I don't think he would probably be in a position to comment very openly on it, is to what extent a change of administration, either to Obama or to McCain, would change that dynamic or not in terms of the willingness of those populations to follow their own leadership in this kind of current engagement with the United States.
Well, that's for sure a question on which he's going to be very uninteresting, to tell you the truth, especially if he's going to kind of race in California on that. We want to open it up to everybody and different thoughts, but let me give, since no one asked me, let me give you my thoughts on David Miliband, and it has to do with a larger issue I think we're facing. When he does give the very interesting idea that the food, fuel, and credit are all crunching at the same time. That's a nice way to encapsulate it. He ends that great blare and great flourish of trumpet blaring with the idea that, we all have to muddle through this. And which is, I guess, is a typical British way of seeing the world. But it's not very inspiring, it's not very directive, and it's not very comforting to those of us who are not in leadership right now. And I guess my feeling is that that's pretty representative of what's happening right now. That while you say, Andrew, that the UK is not taking any real leadership, and you're struck by that, I would say, that's pretty true for the Bush administration right now. And I think of that in terms of not just the end of the Bush administration, but the whole election that we're into, that is terribly exciting, especially on the Democratic side. But the fact is that I'm searching for new ideas in this election. I'm searching for some kind of new thoughts, and maybe I'm a fly in amber, but I think of the 1980 election and of Ronald Reagan, in which I had some participation, a minor role, and you think of SDI coming on shortly, you think of supply-side economics, you think of the Reagan Doctrine, you think of all these kind of things that, everybody's fighting about now for the last 40 years about whether the ideas were right, were they wrong, did they do more harm than good, whatever they were, but they were ideas. There was something new going on. There was going to be a real change in the administration when Reagan came on, and by God, there was a real change. And I'm looking around now. Can you name anything on the magnitude of the three I gave you, but I could give you five more, that Reagan really broke the furniture and shook things up? And like I say, there's 2 weeks ago in the front page of the business section of the New York Times, a big article, did supply-side economics work or not? You have, that's why Harry Truman said, give me a one-handed economist, because a one-armed economist, because on the one hand it did this, and on the other hand it did that. And so you don't know. Here it is, what is it, 25, 30 years later. But the fact is, it was a very interesting and new idea. I don't see among the three candidates right now, soon to be two, those kind of interesting ideas. I don't see, as appealing and wonderful person as the foreign minister is, those kind of ideas. I don't see among Gordon Brown or Sarkozy or these people. Is it that we're in a depletion of ideas right now, or that the problems are too awesome for us, or something wrong with our political system that we cannot really come up with any new approaches to any problem that I see?
Well, I would question the idea that big ideas are always a good thing. I think if you look at the Iraq War, for example, the charitable understanding of the administration's, decision to go forward with that was that it was, looking at the map and kind of envisioning a different world, and sometimes these kinds of great plans, either they succeed spectacularly or they tend to fail spectacularly. And I wonder if it may simply be, as you say, because the problems are very difficult and complicated, and no one can think of anything sort of clean and easily articulated, apart from Obama kind of calling for a change, but in a fairly nebulous way. Or it may be a sense that that people are kind of tired of these grand schemes and promises.
I think Obama is a big idea.
Okay, go on.
I think that the possibility of President Obama for the United States and the world is actually a huge idea. It's a huge idea because it does several things at once. It first of all completely overhauls the image of the United States in the entire world, especially the developing world. And that, in terms of one's strategic long-term interests of the United States, is huge. And I simply mean by the fact of his biography, the fact of his face, the fact of his approach, the fact of his global emergence and upbringing, which what we're finding right now, and I think what's really happening in this election, is whether Americans are comfortable enough with that move. And it is a big move. It is psychologically and a huge move. People know that. Certainly the people in Appalachia know that. They know it means an end to the America they understood as their America. That's why they're voting against him in such high numbers. And I think what it will mean to Africa and the Middle East is hard to fathom. Now, it will be, and then if you add to that the fact that Obama is clearly proposing a different interaction between the United States and the rest of the world than we've had, and in a clearer way, in the clearest way since the end of the Cold War. If you think of Clinton as essentially, and I think one should, as a pragmatic muddler in the 90s, and then we had the 9/11 moment, and then we had the reassertion of American hegemony. And the notion that the United States must control and defeat all forces against it across the planet. The new American century, that concept of America's role in the world, and indeed the future of the world, led by a Texan. And now we're given this option of a kind of slightly mellower version of that in McCain, a certainly more mature version of that in McCain, or a leap. And I think that's what that could happen. I think it is a leap, and I think it's a huge idea, which is why I think the Obama candidacy is historically the same as the Reagan candidacy in terms of what it will do to America's self-understanding and the world's understanding of the United States. And that, especially when combined with his clear commitment to alter our diplomacy and in the Middle East, for example, dramatically. And let's face it, if the United States president talks with the Supreme Leader Khamenei in Iran in direct talks, that is going to alter dramatically every political and cultural thing we think we know about America's relations with the Middle East. The second huge idea is ending carbon dependence, which is, a phenomenally global and important idea, which the British government has pioneered more, and Europe is clearly involved in, which is also about, it's not about just the environment, it's also about managing to counter Russia, Venezuela, Iran, Shiite Iraq, which will eventually become an Iranian satrapy if we succeed. It's about reconstructing the global economy to defang that threat to the liberal order. So those are huge things, Ken, I think. Okay. I mean, I think that's why this is a huge election, and why an Obama election, which I don't think is inevitable at all, will not just be, we're having an interesting cultural moment. It will be a hinge upon which history will turn.
Take it from there.
All right. Brooke Heaton from the Atlantic Council. I don't have any huge ideas to contribute, just a quick question. With the election in November, we'll eventually be bombarded with these maps of red states and blue states, but when you look at it at the sub-state level, you really find out it's basically, blue cities, red counties, especially in Iowa. And I'm wondering do you see, as much as we talk about new media impacting U.S. relations with Europe or, the global community, do you see a potential for new media to impact relations between the urban and rural divide in the United States that I see? And is it exacerbating the problem, or is it impacting the problem in any kind of positive way? In terms of blogging, YouTube.
Start that.
Yeah, okay.
No, go ahead, Andrew. Go ahead, because it was a question about blogging. So
yes, I do. I don't, and I think that if you think of Howard Dean's sort of 50-state strategy, and you think of the fact that, previously speaking, the ability to reach people in those areas was affected by geography, by the ability to get there. And I think that's still actually critical. I still think you have to be in those communities, and those people have to have direct access to outside and talking to other people to get a real change. But clearly, people on their modems in rural wherever really are more in touch with and aware of, if they want to be, the broader world in a way that was never the case before. But the paradox is, I think, that the growth of new media, which you would think would promote a dispersal of human beings, has not synchronized with that. That we're actually becoming a more urban society. We're living closer together. In fact, environmental concerns may mean that the cities are going to make more sense in the future. It's much less expensive to house and heat and look after a bunch of people in an apartment building in the middle than dispersed across a rural area. So I don't know. I think that those two things are happening. But I do think that the capacity for an insurgent campaign like the Obama campaign to reach people in places where they never reached them before is been enabled by this new media in ways that I don't think people have fully understood. I think that's the other revolutionary part of this campaign. I mean, we just found out 200,000 new donors for this guy in April, of which 94% were $200 or less. Now, they're not all coming from big cities. Now that's an enormously interesting dynamic, and the the fact that geography becomes less important in terms of being able to listen and speak may well do this. But I really don't know the final answer to your question.
I think another interesting dynamic will be there's sort of two potentials. One is what you've just described, what Andrew's just described, and then another question is the effect of this new medium on all the sorts of rumors and misinformation that gets thrown, and will really start to get thrown once the general election really kicks off. And I mean, I was really struck by the number of people that still think that Obama may be Muslim. The whole.
So far as you know.
Yes. I didn't write that article.
That was Senator Clinton's final statement. He is not a Muslim so far as she knows.
Yes.
Fran Burwell, also from the Atlantic Council, and I wanted, if I could, to turn this conversation to our TN 2020 colleagues, and to return to also a big idea from the post-war era, which is the European Union. And in my thinking, this is one of the revolutionary things that happened after the Second World War. But we now face an instance where there's a political divide in Europe, too, between the elites and the publics on the EU. And not just in the UK. We only have to look at the turnout rates for European Parliament elections to know that the Union is not very healthy, and to see the fear of governments to hold referendums on the treaty. And I saw a number of you with your hands up with probably comments and questions on other things, but I'd really welcome your comments on how new media, some of you are bloggers, how should you play a role in bridging this elite public divide in Europe that is really, from my perspective, hindering political development. Some people may see that as a good thing, and some people may see it as a bad thing. So.
Let's pass it along on the TN 2020. Let me just remind you that TN 2020 is brought to you by the British Council, and the whole idea of it is a new network to really energize the transatlantic alliance on that. It's made up of entrepreneurs, thought leaders, public servants in the United States, Britain, and the continent, and it's just a terrific group. It has 30 members now. It's going to expand to 100 members at their next gathering in Ireland, and you'll see it's really the best and the brightest of the coming generation. Please.
Well, let's hope. My name is Marietje. I'm from the Netherlands, and it's in fact one of those countries that has a great divide between the political leadership and its people. It was also shown in the no vote against the European Constitution. I don't know if I have an answer. I just think a few observations that may also explain why leaders such as Miliband and Obama are so inspiring. I think for a long time the baby boom generation has sort of hold a monopoly on leadership in business, government, basically all of society, and I feel like it has shut off the ambition of a whole generation. And they have resorted to, I think, very creative and alternative ways of making sort of, contribution through practical idealism. I see many platforms in the Netherlands of young groups, diverse groups of people who are making a difference on a very local level, but who have kind of lost the perspective of this platform being accessible to them. And I think with the faces and the ideas that are already revolutionary of this new generation of leaders, it awakens the next generation, sort of the people who are between 20 years and 30 years old now on both sides of the Atlantic, to be inspired again and to look for how to realize their ambitions on a very practical level, I think, on a global stage. So I'm hoping that with the bridge generation of leaders that will appeal to the younger generation. And what would be interesting to see is how, with the changing populations, which we haven't talked so much about, but which is something that greatly interests me, foreign policy is going to change. Because not only does the younger generation feel disconnected to leadership, we have people who have very different backgrounds, share very different histories, and who may have a very different outlook on the world in general. And once they get leadership positions, that will have a great influence.
Mm-hmm. Other thoughts in here? Yeah.
I don't know where.
I think the disconnection between political elites and population is easily solved by changing elite. That's the only thing you can do. Now, the real question is how you change it. But I mean, it may sound like a joke, but it's not, because I come from a country which is Italy, which is fascinating but strange country from this perspective, because I mean, we in Italy there is the idea that we are a gerontocracy, as it's called, in a sense that people in power, particularly in politics, and then, you know, as a spillover effect in all sectors from business to public administration, are people from 65, 70 years old on. So basically, when we refer to, I listened to David Miliband, I'm completely fascinated but also frustrated by the fact that, you know, we have a foreign minister for almost a little bit more than 40 years old. In Italy, basically, we refer to young politicians where you are around 55, 57. So that's the idea. And of course, the disconnection is there for the simple reason that these people are grown up during a era, during the Cold War, basically. They were doing politics at the beginning of the 80s already. So of course that there is this disconnection, because simply you cannot change the mindset of people who are grown up and, you know, have been educated and been exposed to a world which is no longer there. So the real idea is how, and I think part of the goal of the transatlantic network towards 2020 is to basically empower a new generation towards different sectors in different countries to avoid that, you know, once those people in some countries like Italy have gone, which basically means that there will be 80 years old, the next generation to come won't be the generation which is 60 or 65, because otherwise we are lost. That we need to bridge the gap and to basically jump onto the following generation already, because otherwise you will always have the grandfather of David Miliband talking to David Miliband when they meet foreign minister to foreign minister, you know. So that's the key issue, I think.
Could I just add to that?
Sure.
I agree overwhelmingly with what you just said. As you might surmise from what I said before, but blogging in the new media has helped that a lot because the barriers of entry are so low. Mm-hmm. So that what you have seen in new media, and I think this is what's happened, is that people have emerged as media giants at a much younger age. Yeah. That the politics is yet to really kind of adapt to what the new media has shown. Is that in a real meritocracy, people should be able to emerge representing their generations at any time. They shouldn't have to go through this extraordinary lengthy period. Now, Britain, of course, has a long tradition of this, actually. I mean, it's Blair. Blair would have been regarded as, certainly if you listen to what the Republicans say about Obama, Blair would have been regarded as utterly unqualified to be Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. Utterly. Yeah, he'd never had an executive experience in his entire life. He'd never run anything. And he was younger, way younger than Obama currently is. Mm-hmm. So I just think that the new media.
But you have the difference of he's a member of the parliament, he's a shadow minister, so you get the idea that he's in, you know, the bullpen in training camp right there.
For barely any time at all. I mean,
okay, but he's there in all that. I loved your remark about the elites and the masses. Really, Bertolt Brecht, the great playwright, wrote once that, you know, for a dictator, if the masses just don't go along with what he wants, he'll just have to change the masses. And that was his solution to that. Please.
I'd just like to go back to the issue of the disconnect within the EU that you were mentioning, Fran, between the institutions and then the public at large. I come from Ireland. We're having a referendum on the Lisbon Treaty, the only member state to do so. And there's been widespread criticism across the EU that countries such as France, Italy, Germany are not having referendums. And my newspaper published a poll just this weekend, just looking at attitudes right now towards the Lisbon Treaty. And it was quite striking that the 18 to 30 age group actually had some of the most negative attitudes towards the Lisbon Treaty, towards further EU integration. And this is an age group that's often referred to as the Erasmus generation. You know, we were born after our countries joined the EU. Many of us took part in the Erasmus educational program, this idea of developing a European identity. So I think that's quite telling. If within that age group...
What does it tell us?
You're seeing more...
How do you explain that?
Well, I think it's that disconnect between the institutions and the public. And recently I was speaking with the Irish Minister for European Affairs, and he was saying, look, all this talk about democratic deficit within the EU is missing the point. He said there's a communications deficit. And I think this is very true. Now, some EU officials say that with the Lisbon Treaty, they're going to address the democratic deficit. It's going to give more power to national parliaments. It's going to give more power to the European Parliament to try and involve people in the EU more. But I think it's a major, major challenge.
But that is very interesting. If Ireland is the only one going to vote on the Lisbon Treaty, and if the younger ones are more opposed to it than the older ones, that's a very interesting fact. David, did you want to jump in on that? And please, join us.
Yeah, I wanted to say, I mean, it's not just an issue about people, it's an issue about institutions. And I think what in the UK, what Thatcher started and Gordon Brown finished in '97 was a very different way of managing economies, from something very heavy and cumbersome to simply trying to target inflation and letting the rest of it deal with itself. And we're going into an era. I mean, I absolutely agree with Andrew. This is an era of big ideas. The idea that we're going to decarbonise the economy by 2050. This is a change that's as big as the Industrial Revolution and has got to be much, much quicker. This is absolutely huge. So we're moving into an era where governments are going to be required to take on massive new responsibilities, and they're going to have to find ways of doing that in a light and flexible way. Otherwise, they're just going to choke us in complexity. And what new media has done is it's changing the media institutions. Rather than these very big and heavy and cumbersome institutions, you get kind of one-man bands like Andrew, who become media phenomenon in themselves and then get absorbed back into the media landscape. So I think the lesson from new media is to look for that level of innovation where you can achieve something as effective but do it with much more light and less cumbersome structures.
Mm-hmm. Right back here.
I just want to play devil's advocate for a
Sure.
moment, and maybe because I come from old media, but I've been struck. At the Post, for example, we are devoting a huge portion of our resources towards coverage of the Iraq War, at great cost, to other sections of the paper, individual costs and risks, and yet so. Clearly, the newspaper world, at least the major newspaper world, is paying a lot of attention to the war. As an issue nationally, it's kind of receded. It's not what everyone's talking about, and it seems to me that just the same way that the carbon footprint and dependence issue, is something that one can, to some extent, thank new media for keeping attention on and forcing our leaders to look at. I'm surprised at the extent to which the Iraq War is not being carried forward by that.
I like to make one other point, which is that the other thing that we see emerging in this kind of very light footprint, flexible, global way is Islamist terrorism. I mean, I think that's the model of the new terrorism too. It's not a national liberation movement. It isn't even, in some respects, that well organized on the ground. It is a free-floating, internet-based, branded, not very top-down franchise that allows these individual cells to do what they want to do, but it has to provide some. Now that's a model that the nation states who have to defend themselves against this have to get their heads around and have to begin to develop strategies that are similarly informed by this new media and this new world. And I think that's also another challenge. You're right. The old model of the behemoth state controlling and organizing and taking care of all of its citizens is declining fast. And the British, I have to say, I mean, yes, Britain pioneered this in a way. I mean, Thatcher and as you put, Brown in '97, very.
Are these networks for terrorism? That makes it far more difficult to combat, doesn't it, Andrew?
Yeah, it can. It can. It requires a different strategy in countering it. I don't think we've quite figured it out. We are beginning to figure it out, but I don't think we've succeeded.
Yeah, we'll take it just a few more. Go on, and then go back there. Yeah.
I'm Scott Paul. I write for Steve Clemens' blog, The Washington Note. Wanted to go back to...
Steve Clemens wrote for Steve Clemens.
He does, I've heard. Oh, okay. Much more often than I do, unfortunately. Wanted to go back to something that came up as sort of a common theme when David Miliband was talking, and also you, Andrew. And that's that people in the UK specifically, and Europe generally, actually do want the United States to play a constructive leadership role in the world. And what I find striking is that Americans believe that less and less. Polling shows actually more Americans are likely to think of the UK as having a positive influence in the world than the United States. And when people see, just my general sense is when people see President Bush standing up in a joint press conference with European leaders and they're saying, well, thank you so much for your partnership. We really value the United States. You're a great partner. People just sort of roll, some people, at least, in a particular section of the United States public dialogue, start rolling their eyes and say, well, they probably don't really mean that. And going back to David Miliband's sort of trifecta of interests that you need to move foreign policy, okay, well, governments, I think, understand the need for the United States to play a constructive role. Businesses certainly understand it, but the public movement, the mobilization right now, seems to be around this idea that the United States is incapable of having a positive influence. And that sort of seems to be embodied in the movement behind Ron Paul. And, you know, it doesn't reflect broad public understanding, but in terms of mobilization, it's experiencing the greatest amount of growth. So then going back to this original topic, how, if at all, does new media play a role in sort of bridging this gap, this misunderstanding? And how can Americans better understand how they're needed in the world? How can Europeans then also start to communicate and reach out and say, yes, you actually are needed. We don't need you to ultimately reduce your footprint. We just need you to change it a little bit.
Good. Back here, and then up here, and then we're going to adjourn.
John Herbosis, I write America Blog. Okay, I'm sorry. John Herbosis, I write America Blog, one of the large political blogs in the States on the left. And I wanted to ask sort of a contrary question, which is, last night at the dinner we all had, or a number of us had, and today, there's this supposition that there is a divide between, you know, elites and the people. This word I kept hearing you guys use more than I've heard in the last month, other than at Republican debates. That this divide is bad, that it's gotten worse. And two sort of questions regarding this. One, last night we were told that the American people would never vote for the Kyoto Treaty, and therefore apparently that makes it a bad thing because somebody in West Virginia would really have an informed opinion on the Kyoto Treaty, would be my first point. The second thing is, with regards to Italy, you made me think as well, as a blogger, we're often getting criticism about too much democracy, and, you know, do we really want a cacophony of voices? I was in Italy last month and took a wonderful photo, I think, of the Senate elections, a big political poster, and it had 14 different parties on it. And as an American, that just made me laugh. And not to quote George Bush, you know, sometimes you can have too much democracy, is what he said back in 2000, about a little issue we had. But I wonder to what degree is the problem. I mean, is there an issue, not an issue of too much democracy, I don't want to say that, but to what degree do you get into a situation of this, why does this communication have to happen? I mean, why do you all think that there's this divide that needs to be broached? I'm just kind of curious.
Okay, so what's your question? It's not the transatlantic divide, you're talking about the generation?
Just in general, you've talked a lot about the need to reach between these elites and the masses, and I'm just curious, why is it a given that that's a necessary thing to do and a good thing?
Good, okay. Put your mic up here and we'll give you an answer. All right. Go on.
Well, I think there's something to say for a responsible elite also, which is fine and it's necessary. But in the Netherlands, at least, and this happens in more European countries, you see a big rise of populist movements as a result of extreme dissatisfaction by masses of people who feel unheard by the political parties or underrepresented. And they are going somewhere with that negative energy. On internet, speaking of new media, there is a lot of discussion in honesty, which often has highly racist tones, and this discussion is not had in the public debate because there's no space for it. There's no space created for it by the existing institutions. That is a problem, I believe, this polarization or whatever you want to call it. And I think I wanted to relate back to what you said about radical Islam and the spread of it through the new media and to layers of identity, because what I see in Europe is that a solution for including sort of a lost generation of immigrants, children, second, third generation, who are vulnerable to the strategies of these radical movements. One of the solutions that is actually proactively advocated is identification on a local, municipal, city level. And it just adds another layer on a much smaller scale of where people should identify. On top of that, there's the national level. On top of that, there's the EU level. And then on top of that, there's international relations and anything that goes across. I think that is something that hinders the outlook on a European perspective, because a lot of problems are quite practical and quite local and are solved in a local, on a local level of identification. And I think nations are confusing their international policy with their local interests, and that is going to be a challenge over the next
Great. Last
years.
thoughts, Andrew, Narit, on that, or on anything else that happened this morning, and then I just want to thank everybody, and we'll adjourn.
I agree. There is an obvious need not to. I mean, the danger is when you have both new media in the way that it can empower and spread ideas, and you have political institutions that are not effectively responding to all the segments of society, is a very dangerous combination, because it means that the government's political institutions are losing authority. I mean, that's what's happening. They're losing authority. And by losing authority, they lose legitimacy. And they have to find a way to restore that authority and legitimacy, or else we're going to have within Europe, especially with the rise of Islamism, I mean, we already do have this problem, but a very serious internal enemy that will only grow by the lack of ability to actually reach these people, integrate them politically, seem to find a way for them to have genuine democratic input and feel empowered in that way. And this happens on a variety of levels, and can be addressed in a variety of ways. I mean, it can be done simply too. It can be done simply symbolic. You can diffuse certain things, sometimes with just symbols, which is why Obama does have that potential. So I couldn't agree more. This new media is, I think, increasingly something we have to integrate into our understanding of both domestic politics and international politics, because it's an earthquake and it's changing things dramatically.
Nureed? I just learned this morning that Andrew's blog is the most read blog in Iran. No. So, no, that's not right. I unlearned that just now. Widely read.
Iran connection?
When I go through the countries that actually read the blog, I'm amazed at
how high the Iranian is. Yeah.
The level of English, the younger generation, particularly in that country, which I think we should all try and start calling Persia, because there is a Persia and there is an Iran. Those people love the West, support individual freedom, are tapping into this network. This is the new media is a way in which we can leverage those people against the disgusting people that are controlling their lives in Tehran.
Okay. Last thoughts from Nureed Esenman?
Yeah, I just want to expand a little bit on what Andrew was talking about in terms of the responsiveness of governments. And I think that, definitely one problem is when you have a system like the United States, which is just structurally very difficult politically for anyone young to enter. Obama, part of the reason why we're all so impressed with him as a phenomenon is precisely because, we've had basically the same families involved in politics for, 2 decades now, and it's just this sort of sense of this system that has huge barriers to entry. And I think it's worth looking at different systems. The UK is interesting in the sense that it does allow for, youthful people who don't necessarily have executive experience but may actually be quite good at it potentially to enter. On the other hand, the UK has ways to go as well in terms of integrating people who are, Asians, South Asians, and their population. And I think that one of the things that will be interesting to see is to what extent that new media creates the pressure on the governments, not just to bring people in, but to actually systemically change and open up in ways that allow that participation to happen.
That's a very good point. It's like Vatican II or something, opening up the windows on this. Let me thank Patrick Dougherty for last night. That was wonderful, really well done. Steve Clements orchestrated this in a brilliant, brilliant way. Sharon Memis is our den mother and leader on the TN 2020. Jackie Allen, you've been wonderful. Andrew Neal, thank you very much. Andrew Sullivan, that was just wonderful. Nureed Esenman, thank you for joining us. And most of all, our TN 2020 participants, it's all for you and it's all for us. So let's give them all a great round of applause.